When I accepted so little, it wasn't out of neediness. It was because I needed to confirm something my heart had known for a long time. My name doesn't matter as much as the age I carry on my back. I'm 63 years old, and for a long time, the people around me called me complacent. Some said I was submissive, others that I lacked self-esteem. She'll accept anything. With so little, she's still grateful. She should have learned to demand more by now. I heard everything, but I never answered. Because no one there knew what was going on inside me. No one understood that accepting little wasn't giving up. It was observation. I've spent my whole life giving too much. Too much of my time. Too much of my attention. Too much of my care. So, one day, I stopped asking. I stopped remembering dates. I stopped insisting on being present. I stopped explaining how I felt. And that's when everyone started to find it strange. When I accepted a half-hearted invitation without questioning it. When I received superficial affection and didn't complain. When I kept what was left over and didn't fight for more. To them, I seemed weak. To myself, I was finally seeing. There comes a point in life when you get tired of begging for space. And you understand that people's silence says much more than any pretty promise. I accepted little because I needed to see how far they would go when they didn't have to make an effort. I needed to confirm if the love they claimed to feel was real. Or just convenient. And it hurt. In the quietest way possible. Because accepting little hurts when you know you've always offered everything. But sometimes it's the only way to avoid deceiving yourself again. Today I know. Sometimes accepting little is the most painful way to see the truth. I wasn't born this way, accepting so little. There was a time when I gave everything I had and even what I didn't have. From a very young age, I learned that to love was to give of oneself. I grew up watching my mother sacrifice herself for others, always putting everyone else before herself. That became an example. I learned that affection is proven through presence, that love is shown through effort. That those who truly love don't measure sacrifices. And I've carried that with me my whole life. I was an intense woman. Present. Available. The kind who listens attentively, who perceives silence, who anticipates the needs of others. I was always the one who remembers dates, who asks how the day was, who shows up even when no one calls. The one who solves problems, who helps, who emotionally supports those around her. For years, I thought that was a virtue. And perhaps it was. But it was also the beginning of my greatest wound. In the most important relationship of my life, the one that shaped me from the inside, I was everything. Support, care, comfort, understanding. I was there when it was convenient, and when it wasn't. I was there in the easy times and the difficult ones. I was there even when there was no turning back. And little by little, I began to realize something that at the time I refused to accept. I was always giving more than I was receiving. In the beginning, it was small things. A missed call, a forgotten invitation, an absence hastily explained. I justified it. I told myself it was tiredness, routine, lack of time. I always found an excuse for the other person. Always. But time went by, and the balance never shifted. I gave my undivided attention and received quick responses. I offered my presence and received crumbs of time. I insisted, while for me, almost nothing was done. And the worst part wasn't the explicit lack of love. It was the constant feeling of being second best. There were times when I pleaded silently, not with words, but with gestures, with attempts, with insistence disguised as patience. I made myself smaller to fit into the other person's life. I diminished my needs so as not to bother them. I swallowed my desires so as not to seem demanding. Then came the day when I realized something that broke me inside. I was fighting alone. No one asked me to give so much, but no one stood up to offer me more either. That's where my biggest scar was born. The feeling of having been used emotionally, of having been convenient, of having been remembered only when I was needed. Never when I truly needed them. I remember clearly the night I cried silently, sitting on my bed, asking myself when I had become so worthless. It wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. A deep exhaustion from always reaching out and almost never finding a hand in return. That day, I made a silent promise. Not out loud, not for anyone to hear. A promise that was only mine. I would never beg for love again. I wouldn't beg for attention. I wouldn't beg for presence. I wouldn't beg for priority. If someone wanted to be there, they would be. If they wanted to care, they would care. And if they didn't want to, I would learn to observe. That's when I started asking for less and seeing more. It wasn't a sudden change. It was slow, almost imperceptible. First, I stopped nagging. Then, I stopped reminding. Next, I stopped suggesting. I started accepting what came exactly as it came without complaining, without adjusting, without completing. And for the first time, I began to see people as they really were, not as I wanted them to be. I didn't stay cold. I stayed alert. Because when you stop begging, the other person shows you exactly how far they're willing to go. And what seemed like love often turns out to be just habit. It was there, in that quiet point in my story, that I learned to observe more and ask for less. My life on the outside seemed calm, a simple, predictable, almost invisible routine. Inside, I was in a state of constant observation. After I decided to ask for less, everything changed quietly. There were no fights, no breakups, no announcements. I simply stopped filling the spaces that were always mine before. I stopped insisting. I stopped adjusting schedules. I stopped offering myself. I came to accept exactly what came my way. Short invitations, quick visits, phone calls that lasted minutes, messages that arrived too late. And I kept saying that everything was fine. If they called me at the last minute, I went. If they remembered me last, I accepted. If they offered me the leftovers, I thanked them. From the outside, people thought I didn't care. Some said I had become too calm. Others interpreted it as maturity. Some even thought I was detached. No one imagined that behind that calm acceptance, I was documenting everything. Every gesture, every absence, every choice. I observed who made an effort and who only showed up when it was convenient. I observed who asked about me and who only responded when I sought them out. I observed who noticed my silence and who seemed relieved by it. It was curious how, when I stopped asking, almost no one offered. There were recurring situations, important dates when I was only remembered afterward, decisions made without my opinion being considered, conversations that happened without me and only came to light when everything was already settled. And I remained there, polite, present, non-confrontational, not because it didn't hurt, but because I needed to see how far they would go. Accepting crumbs became, for me, a form of test, a painful, silent, internal test. I needed to confirm something my heart had long suspected, but that I still didn't have the courage to admit. There were days when I thought about speaking up, about saying I felt left out, about asking for more attention, about reminding everyone of everything I've done. But something inside me held me back. It wasn't pride, it was clarity of mind. If I asked, the answer wouldn't be genuine. If I demanded, the gesture wouldn't be spontaneous. If I begged, the choice wouldn't be real. I needed to see what they would do when they didn't have to exert themselves. And then I started accepting even less on purpose. When given options, I always chose the simplest one, the least sought after, the one that was left over. When there were choices, I didn't prioritize myself. I wanted to see if anyone else would do that for me. They almost never did. I started noticing a pattern. People get used to those who accept little quickly. They settle. They stop trying. They stop worrying. Because they know that, in the end, you'll understand. You'll let it go. You'll accept it. And I accepted. But each acceptance was a silent confirmation. Inside me, the pain grew in a contained way. It wasn't anger. It was clarity. That bitter clarity that comes when you stop deceiving yourself. When you realize that the problem was never a lack of self-love, it was an excess of tolerance. I remembered who I used to be. The woman who moved mountains to please. The one who anticipated things so as not to disappoint anyone. And I compared that to who I was now. Someone who watched being put off, with a serenity that even frightened me. Don't think it was easy. There were nights when I lay in bed feeling an enormous emptiness. A heavy silence, a persistent thought, am I exaggerating? But as soon as the next day arrived, and the same gestures repeated themselves, the doubt would disappear. The little they had was still all they had to offer me. And then came the situation that changed everything. The one where I decided to accept even less, just to confirm it. It was something important. Something that, in the past, I would have fought for. I would have argued about. I would have insisted on. But at that moment, I just listened to the options, took a deep breath, and went with what nobody else wanted. The lesser option, the one that required no effort from anyone, the one that clearly showed my place. No one insisted, no one questioned, no one tried to improve the offer. And there, in that seemingly simple moment, something clicked inside me with a precise pain. It was no longer doubt. It was no longer fear. It was confirmation. I needed to see how far they could go when they didn't have to exert themselves. And they went exactly as far as they always went. Not a step further. There was a specific moment when everything became too clear for me to continue pretending I didn't see it. It wasn't a big scandal. There was no shouting, no arguing, no slamming of doors. That's precisely what hurt the most. The normalcy with which the little I received was offered to me. It was an important situation for me. Not something small, not something irrelevant. It was one of those moments when, if someone truly cares, they show up. If they care, they take action. If they care, they make an extra effort. In the past, I would have insisted. I would have remembered dates, explained feelings, defended my position. But there, I stayed quiet. I listened to the options they gave me as if I already knew how the story ended. Two possibilities were on the table. One required care, attention, adjustment. The other was simple, practical, convenient for others. Before they even asked which one I preferred, I already knew which one would be left for me. And when they asked, I said I would take that one. The poorest, the least regarded, the one that didn't require anyone to change their plans. There was a brief silence, perhaps surprise, perhaps relief. Relief. Yes, today I know. Relief that they didn't have to do anything more. No one tried to improve the offer. No one said, "No, you deserve more." No one asked if I was sure. They accepted too quickly. And at that moment, something inside me tightened in a different way. It was no longer pure sadness. It was a lucid, almost cold pain. The pain of realizing that if I didn't ask, I wouldn't receive. And that, even when I asked in the past, I often only received because I persisted. While everyone continued chatting, working out details, smiling as if everything was perfectly resolved, I felt a weight growing in my chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't hatred. It was the silent confirmation of something I had been avoiding facing. I looked at those people and thought about everything I've done. How many times I've adapted. How many times I've swallowed my desires to avoid causing discomfort. How many times I've chosen the hardest path for myself to make it easier for others. And there, faced with a simple choice, no one even considered doing the same for me. I accepted. I smiled. I said everything was fine. And it really was, in the cruelest sense of the word. Because that everything's fine wasn't resignation. It was an observation. After that, things continued as if nothing had happened. People left. The subject changed. Life went on. But I stayed there alone, with a strange feeling of clarity, as if a fog had suddenly dissipated. There were no more possible excuses. It wasn't a lack of time. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't a lack of awareness. It was a choice. The little they gave me wasn't by chance. It was exactly what they thought was enough. When I got home, I didn't cry immediately. I walked through the rooms in silence, sat down, stood up, took a few deep breaths. My body reacted before my mind. A profound weariness took hold of me, as if I had been carrying something heavy for too long. I remembered similar situations from the past that I downplayed at the time. I remembered times when I felt out of place and thought I was being overly sensitive. I remembered occasions when I accepted less than I needed just to avoid conflict. All of that was coming back now with a different meaning. These weren't isolated incidents. It was a pattern. And the most painful thing was realizing that I myself helped build this place for myself. Not because I wasn't worth anything, but because I always accepted less than I deserved, believing that love is proven with patience, that affection is built with sacrifice, that, if I were understanding enough, one day I would be chosen without having to ask. But that day never came. That night, I sat alone and stared blankly for a long time. I thought about speaking. I thought about calling someone. I thought about sending a message saying that it had hurt me. But something inside me wouldn't let me, because, at that point, there was no point in explaining anymore. The truth had already been told without words. They showed how far they could go when they didn't need to exert themselves. And that hurt more than any direct rejection. Because explicit rejection still allows for reaction. It allows for defense. It allows for a response. But the little that is offered naturally, that enters slowly, silently, and stays. I stood there, remembering the woman I used to be. The one who gave everything. The one who believed that love multiplied the more it was given. And I realized that, at some point, I had stopped being chosen and had become merely accepted. He accepted it when it suited him. He accepted it when there was room to spare. He accepted it as long as he didn't demand anything. And in that instant, for the first time, I didn't feel weak for accepting so little. I felt strong for seeing. Because the little they gave me spoke louder than any words. After that day, I returned home feeling like someone carrying an invisible weight. It wasn't something that could be put on the table, nor divided into simple sentences. It was a mixture of confirmation, exhaustion, and a kind of mature sadness, the kind that doesn't explode, it just settles in the chest. I entered the house silently. I slowly took off my shoes. I put my bag in the same place as always. Everything seemed the same, but I knew something had changed. Not outside, inside. I sat in the kitchen chair and stayed there, staring at the wall, feeling my whole body protest from years of holding back emotions that never had space to exist. I started thinking about everything I've offered throughout my life. Time that never came back. Presence when no one else was available. Attentive ears, even when I needed to be heard myself. Support during difficult times that weren't even mine. How many times did I put my own desires aside, thinking that's what love was? Waiting, understanding, yielding. And there, alone, I asked myself a question I had avoided for a long time. Was it worth loving like that? It wasn't regret. It was exhaustion. A profound exhaustion of someone who realizes they've given more than they've received for years and who called it maturity, kindness, patience. Perhaps I confused love with resistance. Perhaps I believed that enduring was a virtue. I got up, went to the bedroom, and sat on the edge of the bed. The silence of the house seemed louder that night. I thought about all the times I'd accepted crumbs so as not to lose someone. All the times I'd convinced myself that it was what it was. It was the moment. It was just a phase. How many phases last a lifetime? What hurt the most wasn't the little I received in that specific episode. It was realizing that it wasn't an exception. It was continuity. A chapter consistent with everything that came before. I had simply chosen to see it this time. I felt like crying, but the tears wouldn't come easily. It was as if the tears themselves were tired. Instead, I felt a tightness in my chest, shortness of breath, a sense of emptiness that didn't scream, it just occupied space. For a few minutes, I wondered if it wouldn't have been better to react, if I shouldn't have spoken up, questioned, demanded. But I soon understood that it wouldn't have changed anything. Because when someone only offers a little, it's not for lack of warning. It's due to emotional limitations. I could have asked for more. I could have explained how I felt. I could have insisted. But deep down, I knew, if I needed to beg, the answer would already be given. It was there that I recognized something difficult to admit. I spent a good part of my life diminishing myself to fit in, adjusting expectations, pruning desires, silencing needs, always thinking that if I were less, perhaps I would be more loved. But that night, for the first time, I didn't blame myself. I didn't call myself weak. I didn't judge myself for accepting so little. I simply acknowledged that I was tired of being the only one to adapt. I walked through the house slowly, like someone revisiting memories. I remembered moments when I felt invisible and pretended I was nothing. I remembered interrupted conversations, invitations made out of obligation, shallow affections. All of that was now organizing itself within me like pieces of a puzzle finally assembled. The fall wasn't a tumble, it was an emptying. The feeling that something I had been holding up on my own had finally come loose. It hurt, yes, but it also brought a strange calm. Because, despite the sadness, there was a new kind of peace there. The peace of not having begged, of not having explained myself, of not having emotionally humiliated myself to be chosen. I had remained silent, and that, somehow, preserved something within me. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I thought, maybe this pain is the price of stopping pretending. Maybe confirming what I already knew was inevitable so that something new could begin. Not something external, but internal. I was no longer willing to diminish myself to fit in. I no longer wanted to justify the other person's absence. I no longer wanted to transform absence into understanding. That night, I understood that self-love is not born from speeches, but from silent boundaries. And even though it hurt, even though I felt the weight of the truth, I knew I wouldn't go back. Because, for the first time in a long time, I wasn't running away from the pain. I was looking at it head on. The confirmation didn't come as a shock. It came as a prolonged silence. After that episode, the days passed without any change. No questions, no attempts to reconnect, no messages saying, "Are you okay?" Or "Did that bother you?" Nothing. The world went on as normal, and that's exactly what confirmed everything. I realized that when someone is truly important, their absence makes a mark. Mine didn't. In the early days, there was still a silent expectation within me. It wasn't hope, it was habit. That old reflex of someone who had always been the available party in the relationship. A part of me still hoped that someone would notice, that someone would miss me, that someone would find my withdrawal strange. But nobody found it strange. And that realization was harder than any words spoken. Because when no one notices your absence, it becomes clear that your presence was always convenient, not essential. I started noticing the details. The conversations continued without me. Decisions were made without my name coming up. The meetings went on, stories were told, laughter ensued, and I was out of it. Not aggressively excluded, just naturally forgotten. And that's when I understood, when someone gets used to you accepting little, they start to believe that's all you deserve. There was a specific day when this truth became impossible to ignore. It wasn't a big event, nor a fight, nor a harsh statement. It was something simple, small, almost banal. I learned about something important that had happened, something that, in the past, they would have made a point of telling me, something I had always followed closely. But this time, I found out from someone else, like someone who discovers by chance that they are no longer part of the inner circle. At that moment, I felt my body react before my mind, a tightness in my stomach, a strange warmth in my face, and soon after, a disconcerting clarity. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was the right place. My place in that relationship had become clear. I was someone who could be put off, or never. And the most painful thing was realizing that I always knew it, I just didn't want to admit it. There, sitting alone, I thought about all the times I accepted less so as not to lose. Less attention, less presence, less care. Always believing that, if I were patient enough, the other person would learn to value me. But no one learns to value those who are always adapting. The hardest moment of confirmation came when someone finally said it, without realizing the weight of what they were saying. "You're so understanding. You never worry about those things." I never care. Or was I never a priority? The phrase fell like a soft, yet deep blade. There was no malice. There was sincerity. And that's what hurt. Because it revealed that my attitude of accepting little had taught me exactly how I should be treated. I smiled. A polite, practiced, automatic smile. The kind of smile women learn early on so they don't seem difficult, needy, or dramatic, but inside, something shut down completely. That night, I understood that the confirmation I sought wouldn't come in the form of an apology, nor of regret, nor of winning her back. It had already come in the constancy of indifference. I accepted very little, because I already knew that was all they had to offer. And this phrase wasn't born bitter. It was born lucid. I spent years believing that love was about persistence, that bonds were maintained through unilateral effort, that maturity meant swallowing frustrations in silence. But there, finally, I realized I was confusing love with self-abandonment. There was no final conversation. There was no confrontation. There was no dramatic scene. There was only an internal distancing, a decision that didn't need to be announced, because it had already been made within me. I stopped waiting. It may seem simple, but stopping waiting is one of the hardest things there is, because waiting keeps the illusion alive, and letting go of the illusion requires courage. In the following days, I noticed something curious. No one noticed my change. I spoke less, offered less, asked fewer questions. And yet, everything remained the same. This confirmed what I feared and at the same time, what I needed to accept. My presence was never noticed for who I was, but for what I gave. And when I stopped delivering, there was no lag, there was continuity. This realization struck me with a mixture of pain and relief. Pain at recognizing how little value they placed on me. Relief at finally stopping doubting myself. Because, for a long time, I wondered if the problem was me, if I asked for too much, if I felt too much, if I expected too much. But then it became clear, I expected the basics, and the basics never came. The final confirmation needed neither applause nor tears. It came silently, maturely, almost serenely. An understanding that doesn't shout, it simply settles in. I wasn't rejected at that specific moment. I was revealed. Revealed to myself. Revealed in the way others acted when I was no longer trying to fit in. And for the first time, I didn't try to change that. I didn't ask for explanations. I didn't ask questions. I didn't try to fix anything. Because I understood something fundamental. When someone offers you little, it's not because you're worth little. It's because it's all that person can give. And accepting that hurt deeply. But it also gave me back something I had lost a long time ago. Clarity. At that point, there was no more doubt. No misplaced hope. No hidden expectation. There was only the truth. Naked and complete. And curiously, along with it came a strange peace. The peace of someone who finally stops negotiating their own worth. I accepted little to confirm what I already knew. And it was confirmed. Not through words, but through absence. The change wasn't immediate. It didn't happen the next day, or the following week. It began slowly, almost imperceptibly, like someone relearning to breathe after holding their breath for a long time. After that silent confirmation, I didn't take any dramatic action. I didn't cut ties all at once. I didn't make speeches. I didn't announce separations. I simply started doing something I had never done before. I stopped forcing myself. I stopped initiating conversations when no one else did. I stopped anticipating other people's needs. I stopped offering myself before being asked. And above all, I stopped justifying the shortcomings of others as if it were my responsibility. At first, it hurt, because for years, I confused love with continuous effort. I thought that if I slowed down, everything would crumble. That if I didn't sustain the bond alone, it would end. And in part, I was right. Some things ended. Some relationships simply withered when I stopped nurturing them myself. And that's when the first sign of liberation came, albeit a painful one. That which only exists through your insistence is not a bond. It's disguised emotional dependence. There were days when I felt selfish. Days when I thought I was being too harsh. Guilt appeared subtly, telling me I was exaggerating, that I was being cold, that I was changing too much. But little by little, I began to realize something important. The guilt only appeared when I chose myself. And that said a lot about the place I occupied. I began to observe my own behavior as if I were looking at someone from the outside. I noticed how many times I accepted invitations I didn't want. How many times I silenced discomfort to maintain peace. How many times I smiled just to avoid seeming ungrateful. And for the first time, I began to ask myself, peace for whom? Because there was no peace within me. Liberation began when I understood that love doesn't require self-annihilation. That emotional maturity isn't about swallowing everything in silence. And that accepting little isn't a virtue, it's often a desperate plea not to be abandoned. I reduced my presence where it didn't make a difference. Not out of revenge, not out of pride, but out of honesty with myself. Staying where I wasn't needed began to feel like a kind of personal betrayal. And something curious happened. The less I offered, the lighter I felt. The time that was previously spent waiting for messages, interpreting silences, justifying absences, began to overflow. And at first, this time was frightening, because it brought silence. And silence, when you spend years distracting yourself to avoid feeling, is frightening. But little by little, this silence became space. Space to remember who I was before I molded myself so much. Space to recognize forgotten desires. Space to feel old tirednesses that never had a name. I started taking care of myself without announcing it. Without posting. Without explaining. Small gestures. Sleeping better. Saying no more often. Respecting my physical and emotional limits. Simple things, but which, for me, were revolutionary. There was no applause. There was no external recognition. And that was liberating, because, for the first time, my decisions didn't need to be validated by anyone. Some people distanced themselves completely. Others tried to reconnect when they noticed my absence. But these attempts were different, no longer filled with real presence, but with estrangement, like someone who realizes they've lost something, but doesn't know exactly what. And I observed everything calmly, without haste, without anxiety, without the urgency of being chosen. For the first time, I didn't need to chase after explanations. I already had them all. The greatest liberation wasn't losing relationships. It was losing myself less. It was stopping diminishing myself to fit in. It was accepting that some people only know how to relate as long as you accept little, and they get bothered when you start to respect yourself. I also had to face a difficult truth. For a long time, I taught how I wanted to be treated, accepting less than I deserved, not out of weakness of character, but out of fear. Fear of being alone, fear of not being loved, fear of being forgotten. When that fear lost its power, something inside me reorganized itself. I didn't become cold. I didn't become bitter. I didn't become distant. I became more honest with myself. And that changed everything. I started choosing more carefully where to put my energy. Not every invitation deserved a yes. Not every relationship deserved effort. Not every absence needed to be filled. I learned that love isn't begged for. Presence isn't negotiated. Respect isn't explained. And above all, I learned that accepting little isn't humility, it's a silent plea to be seen. And when that doesn't happen, you need the courage to stop. Today, my life is quieter than before, but it's a different kind of silence. It's not empty, it's whole. A silence that doesn't hurt. A silence that rests. I haven't become inaccessible. I've simply stopped being overly available. And that changed how I see myself. Because when you stop accepting crumbs, it doesn't mean you don't love anymore. It means you finally love yourself too. Liberation didn't come with explosive joy. It came with serenity, with the feeling of no longer needing to prove anything, with the tranquility of knowing that my worth doesn't depend on anyone's attention. Accepting little hurt me deeply, but it freed me from something even more painful, the constant need to be chosen. Today, if I stay, it's because I want to. If I leave, it's because I decided to. And whether someone stays or leaves no longer defines who I am. And that perhaps has been the greatest consequence of all this. I have regained my sense of belonging. For a long time, I thought accepting little was humility. I thought it was maturity. I thought it was love. Today I know that, most of the time, accepting little is just fear of losing. Fear of being alone. Fear of not being chosen. Fear of discovering that we gave more than the other person was willing to receive. Nobody is born wanting crumbs. We learn to accept them when we believe that asking for more will cost too much. I accepted little because I thought that if I demanded too much, I would push away the one I loved. What I didn't understand is that whoever distances themselves when you respect yourself was never truly present. Sometimes the little we accept isn't weakness. It's the courage to see the truth without excuses. Because it's much easier to pretend you don't notice. To pretend everything is okay. To pretend it doesn't hurt when they don't call, when they don't ask, when they don't care. What's truly difficult is admitting that you're becoming alone within a relationship. Accepting less forced me to confront who I was, and who I had stopped being to fit into other people's lives. I needed to learn, as a mature adult, that love isn't a one-sided effort, that care can't be begged for, and that presence isn't something you plead for with endless patience. Many people confuse kindness with submission. They confuse maturity with silence. They confuse love with constant sacrifice. But none of these confusions sustains a healthy relationship. Today, I understand that boundaries don't drive away those who love. They only drive away those who take advantage. And perhaps that's the hardest part to accept. Not everyone who stays by our side truly wants to see us whole. Some only feel comfortable when we are smaller, more available, easier. When you start respecting yourself, it bothers them. When you stop accepting less, it becomes strange. When you stop explaining yourself, it scares them. But that's not loss. It's filtering. If I could say something to someone going through something similar, I would say, observe. Observe how much effort you put in. Observe who appears when you diminish yourself. Observe who disappears when you stop insisting. The truth always comes out when you stop bending over backward. And no, that doesn't mean you'll become cold, distant, or selfish. It just means you'll stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. Self-love isn't selfishness. It's emotional survival. I no longer romanticize crumbs. I don't celebrate the bare minimum. I don't thank for the basics as if they were a favor. I learned, through pain, that what is essential shouldn't be negotiated. And if someone can only stay when you accept little, maybe the problem was never that you asked for too much. Today, I prefer simple but whole relationships. Few but true. I prefer honest silence to empty presence. I prefer being alone to being poorly accompanied by myself. Accepting little taught me something no one had ever said aloud. Whoever truly loves you doesn't test you with absence. If you've made it this far, maybe this story has touched a wound in your heart. Maybe you're also accepting less than you deserve. Maybe you're trying too hard to maintain something that only exists because you sustain it alone. So I ask you, with affection, not as a judgment, have you ever accepted less just to avoid losing someone? And what did you discover when you stopped insisting? If this story resonated with you, write it in the comments. Share your experience. Sometimes putting it into words is the first step to freedom. Like and follow the channel. Here, we don't romanticize crumbs. Here, we understand scars.